When love turns into routine and silence becomes louder than words, what do? Stay and endure, or walk away to rediscover yourself? This is the story of Clara, a woman who slowly loses herself in a loveless marriage of 6 years. Her husband, Nathan, is present but emotionally absent. Just when she begins to feel invisible, a neighbor named Lucas enters her life, kind, attentive, and quietly understanding. What begins as casual small talk evolves into something far more intimate, not physically but emotionally. This isn't just a story about temptation. It's about a woman confronting the ache of being unseen and the courage it takes to come back to yourself. Let yourself feel it. You might just recognize a piece of your own story here. If this story spoke to something inside you, if you've ever felt lost in the silence between two people, subscribe to the channel for more stories about love, heartbreak, healing, and self-discovery. Every subscriber is a step closer to building a space where emotions are heard and never ignored. Because sometimes, the most powerful story is the one we finally allow ourselves to tell. I used to think love faded like old wallpaper, slowly, quietly, until one day you don't even notice it's there. That's how it felt with Nathan. 6 years of marriage had turned into a predictable rhythm: morning coffee, work emails, silent dinners, and nights spent on opposite sides of the bed. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even inattentive in a malicious way. Just absent. Present in body, absent in every other way that mattered. Nathan worked in corporate finance, a high-rise man with a briefcase heart. Lately, his job had taken over every conversation, every meal, every moment we shared. I'd tell him about my day, little things like my failed attempt at sourdough or a book I was reading, and he'd nod, eyes still glued to his phone. I convinced myself this was normal. Marriages evolve. People settle. The spark becomes a steady flame, right? But I wasn't prepared for the flicker of something else, something unexpected. It began the day Lucas moved in next door. I first saw him carrying boxes from a moving truck, sweat glistening on his arms under the summer sun. He looked to be in his mid-30s, like us, with an easy smile and a voice that carried calmness even in small talk. I offered him a glass of lemonade. He accepted, with a thank you grin that lingered a second longer than it needed to. "Lucas," he said, extending a firm hand. "Just moved from Portland, fresh divorce, fresh start." I laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. "I'm Clara, I live here with my husband." His gaze flickered briefly to my ring finger, then back to my eyes. "Well, it's nice to have a friendly face next door. Harmless. Casual." That's what I told myself. Over the next few weeks, Lucas became a familiar presence. He'd wave from his porch, offer to carry in my groceries, even helped fix a jammed cabinet when Nathan wasn't home. I thanked him with coffee one morning, and we sat on my porch talking about music, childhood, everything but relationships. That day, for the first time in months, I laughed. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that lifts something heavy off your chest. Later that evening, I tried to tell Nathan about Lucas's quirky story of mistaking dish soap for laundry detergent. He barely looked up. Yeah, that's funny," he mumbled, scrolling through emails. I stared at him for a long moment. "Do you even hear me anymore?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He glanced up, brows raised. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said, brushing it off. "Forget it." But I didn't forget. The more invisible I felt around Nathan, the more seen I felt around Lucas. I knew it wasn't right to feel that way, but feelings aren't polite. They don't ask for permission. I mentioned my growing loneliness to Mia, my best friend since college. We sat in our usual coffee shop, sipping cappuccinos under the hum of quiet jazz. "You're not crazy," she said, tapping her spoon against her cup. "Men like Nathan forget the woman beside them when they chase the next promotion." I sighed. "It's not like I'm asking for grand gestures. I just want to feel noticed." She leaned in, smirking slightly. "You do realize your new neighbor notices everything about you, right? I mean, you've told me more stories about him in a month than about your husband in a year." I frowned. "It's not like that." "I didn't say it was," she replied. "But maybe you should ask yourself why it almost is." That question stuck with me. One evening, as I watered the plants on my porch, Lucas appeared with a small bag in hand. Brought you some lavender cuttings, thought you might like them, he said, holding them out. I took them, fingers grazing his. Thank you, they're beautiful. He smiled again, that same warm, lingering smile. And for just a second I forgot what it meant to feel unwanted. That night, lying beside Nathan in silence, I stared at the ceiling, lavender scent drifting from the kitchen counter. I couldn't help but wonder what happens when the person who notices your absence isn't your husband, but your neighbor. And worse, what happens when you start noticing them back. The lavender withered after a week, but the memory of Lucas's smile didn't. Nathan came home later each evening now, often with the same excuse: meetings ran over or client calls dragged on. He'd walk through the door distracted, kiss my cheek out of habit, and disappear into his office before I could say more than a sentence. Our dinners became silent routines. I'd ask how his day went. He'd grunt something vague. When I mentioned the lavender Lucas had given me, he barely reacted. Nice, he said, eyes on his phone, fingers tapping endlessly. I could feel it, this quiet erosion between us. No dramatic fights, no sharp words. Just a soft, persistent hollowing out of what we used to be. Lucas, on the other hand, was everywhere. Cutting his grass in the morning, chatting over the fence in the afternoon, offering small gestures that felt strangely intimate. He noticed things. You changed your hair, he said one morning as I stepped outside. It suits you. Nathan hadn't noticed at all. Sometimes I'd find excuses to step out, watering plants, checking mail, adjusting the porch lights, just to catch a moment of conversation with Lucas. It was harmless, I told myself. Innocent. One particularly cloudy afternoon I heard a knock on my door. Lucas stood there holding a toolbox. You mentioned your kitchen drawer was stuck, right? Thought I'd take a look. I hesitated, then stepped aside. Sure, come in. I watched as he crouched under the counter, sleeves rolled up, focused and silent. His presence filled the room in a way Nathan's never did anymore. There you go, he said after a few minutes, pulling the drawer open smoothly. Just a loose track. Thank you, I said, maybe too softly. He didn't move right away. His eyes met mine. You don't look happy lately. I swallowed hard, caught off guard. I'm fine. You don't have to be, he replied, voice low. Not with me. The air between us thickened. I broke the moment, retreating to the kitchen counter. Would you like coffee, I asked, pretending nothing had happened. He nodded. Sure. We sat at the table, sipping quietly. I asked about his life in Portland, about his divorce. He spoke with a distant sadness, a kind of pain that mirrored mine in surprising ways. She stopped caring, he said. Or maybe I stopped noticing when she did. His words struck a chord in me, echoing louder than I wanted them to. Later I mentioned the visit to Mia over coffee. He said that, she asked, eyes widening. I nodded. It wasn't flirty, not exactly, but it wasn't nothing either. Clara, she said, you're standing at the edge of something. You might not have crossed it yet, but you're already looking over. I haven't done anything wrong, I whispered, more to myself than to her. You haven't, she agreed. But emotional affairs don't start in bedrooms, they start at kitchen tables. Her words stayed with me. That night I tried harder with Nathan. I cooked his favorite meal, rosemary chicken, mashed potatoes, and that stupid chocolate tart he always liked. He came home 2 hours late, talking on Bluetooth as he entered. He nodded at the table. Looks great, I'll eat later, big deadline tomorrow. I stared at him, my heart sinking. I made this for you. He looked up, finally sensing my tone. I appreciate it, see I do, it's just work's insane lately. You're always working, I said, voice trembling. When did we stop being a couple and start being roommates? He sighed. Not this again. I didn't respond. I just sat there watching the steam rise from food that would go cold in unison. Later that night I stood by the window looking out into the dim street. Lucas's porch light was on. He sat outside reading a book, calm and unbothered by the chaos unraveling inside my home. I knew I hadn't crossed a line yet, but it was closer now. Closer than I ever thought I'd allow it to be. And the scariest part wasn't how easy it would be to step over it. It was how much I wanted to. The night of our anniversary I sat alone at the dinner table. Candles flickered against untouched plates, casting shadows on the walls like ghosts of the marriage we used to have. Nathan hadn't called. No message. No excuse. At 9:47 p.m. my phone finally buzzed. A message from his assistant. Mr. Lawson sends his regrets. Urgent client dinner. He wishes you a wonderful evening. No words from him. Just a note passed through someone paid to remember what he forgot. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply stood, blew out the candles, and scraped the food into the trash. The silence in the house felt suffocating, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. I needed air, space, something that didn't feel like a graveyard of forgotten love. I stepped outside, letting the cold air bite my skin. Across the yard, Lucas's porch light was on. He looked up from his book and saw me. "You okay?" he asked softly. "No," I said, "not even close." Without a word, he stood and walked toward the fence. I met him there, arms folded, heart pounding harder than I wanted to admit. "Come inside," he said. "You look like you need a moment to breathe." I hesitated just for a second, then nodded. His house smelled of pine and coffee. Warm and unfamiliar. I sat on the couch, fingers knotted in my lap, while Lucas poured us glasses of wine. "Two anniversaries," he said with a dry smile, raising his glass. "Even the forgotten ones." I laughed bitterly. "You heard?" He nodded. Thin walls. There was a pause, a charged silence that hummed between us. I could feel his eyes on me, not in a predatory way, but in a way that saw too much. "I'm tired," I whispered, "of trying so hard for someone who's already stopped seeing me." Lucas leaned forward, his voice low. "You deserve more than just being tolerated, Clara. You deserve to feel alive again." My breath caught in my throat. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," I admitted, voice trembling. "I don't even recognize who I've become." "You haven't changed," he said. "You've just been buried." That broke me. The tears came quietly, slipping down my cheeks as I turned away, embarrassed. Lucas moved beside me, not saying anything, just offering his presence like an anchor in a storm. I felt his hand on my back, gentle, steady, not demanding. I turned to face him, eyes locking, and in that moment I stopped thinking. The kiss happened naturally. No build-up. No grand music. Just two people drowning in loneliness, clinging to something that felt real. It started tender, hesitant, then it deepened, fueled by everything unsaid. His hands cradled my face. Mine tangled in his shirt. And then just as quickly I pulled away. "I can't," I gasped. "I shouldn't." Lucas's expression softened. "You didn't do anything wrong, Clara. You needed something he stopped giving you a long time ago." But I felt everything was wrong. The room felt too bright now. The silence too loud. "I should go," I said, standing abruptly. He didn't stop me. He didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. He just nodded. "I understand." Back home, the guilt hit like a tidal wave. I stood in the shower for nearly an hour, scrubbing skin that still felt touched. Nathan returned the next morning as if nothing had happened. Coffee in hand. Bluetooth earpiece still in. Already deep into a call. He kissed my forehead and walked past me like furniture. I stood there, dripping wet hair and hollow eyes, wondering how I could feel so invisible after what had just happened. And yet, in the quiet moments, my mind drifted back. Not to the kiss, but to the words Lucas had spoken. "You've just been buried." I started to wonder if that was true. If I had buried myself so deep beneath years of disappointment, I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. But now that I'd come up for air, could I go back under again? Guilt is a quiet poison. It doesn't scream or claw. It seeps slow and constant into everything. In the days following that night with Lucas, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror for too long. Something in my reflection looked unfamiliar. Ashamed. Fragile. Fractured. I didn't see Lucas again. Not because he vanished, but because I avoided every possible chance of running into him. I'd duck behind curtains, pretend to water plants, anything to keep distance between us. It wasn't just shame. It was confusion. Nathan, as always, remained indifferent. He didn't notice the change in me, or if he did, he didn't care enough to ask. He was gone before sunrise, home after dark, always in meetings or calls. His presence felt more like background noise than partnership. One afternoon I confided in Mia again. We sat in her living room, the scent of jasmine candles thick in the air. I crossed the line, I said quietly, twisting a napkin between my fingers. Her eyes didn't widen. She didn't gasp. She just exhaled slowly. Did you sleep with him? No, but I might as well have, I said. There was a kiss and intent, the rest was just circumstance. Mia leaned back, staring at the ceiling. You're not the first woman to reach for someone else when her marriage turns cold. I looked at her sharply. You sound like you've lived this before. She hesitated, then nodded. 3 years ago his name was Colin. We were friends at first. Then one day I woke up and realized I looked forward to his texts more than my husband's presence. Nothing happened, not physically but emotionally. It was an affair. I stared at her, stunned. She'd never mentioned this. What did you do? I asked. I told my husband. He never forgave me, but I think he was grateful I told him. At least it forced us to confront what we were pretending not to see. That night I thought long and hard about her words. About what honesty might cost and what silence already had. 2 days later fate decided for me. Nathan's voice echoed from the hallway. He was on a call, but not the usual clipped tone of business. It was softer. Warmer. Curious. I followed the sound until it cut off abruptly. His phone was left on the kitchen counter. A message flashed across the screen. I miss your laugh. When are you in town again? The contact name was just an initial L. I stared at the screen, hands shaking. A second message appeared. Wish I could have spent last weekend in your arms again. My throat tightened. I had expected guilt but not betrayal. Not like this. When he walked in moments later, I didn't wait. Who's L? I asked, holding up his phone. His face shifted, momentary panic, then flat calm. You went through my phone? I didn't have to, it lit up in front of me. He said nothing for a moment, then sighed. It's not what you think. It never is, I replied bitterly. His expression hardened. You've been distant for months, cold. I needed something else. So did I snapped. But at least I had the decency to feel torn about it. The argument escalated, blame hurled like knives, accusations bleeding into confessions. We were both guilty. Both broken. But more than anything, we were done pretending. By morning, Nathan had packed a suitcase. There was no dramatic farewell, no emotional declarations. Just a quiet acknowledgement that whatever had once held us together had long since unraveled. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt something strange. Not relief. Not sorrow. But clarity. A few hours later, Lucas appeared at my door. He looked hesitant, uncertain. I heard he said softly. I nodded. It's over. I'm here if you need anything. I looked at him. Really looked this time, not as an escape, not as a fantasy, but as a man standing in the aftermath of a life I no longer recognized. Thank you, I said. But I think I need to figure out who I am without needing anyone at all. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. He didn't press. He didn't stay. That night I stood in the center of my living room, silence pressing in from every wall. But this time it wasn't suffocating. It was cleansing. Because sometimes what breaks you also frees you. And maybe the real affair wasn't with another man. Maybe it was with the version of myself I'd abandoned long ago finally coming home.